All right. Let's see. Dream Unending is an atmospheric death doom metal band started by Derek Vella and Justin DeTore of Tumult and Innumerable Forms, respectively. It is decidedly atmospheric music. It is deeply introspective. It is sort of an alternative to the gothic doldrums of romanticist death doom from the early 90s, but definitely influenced by it. You'll hear a little bit of you'll still hear a little bit of Anathema and the sort of Paradise Lost and Cathedral spawned side of British doom metal, along with some old school British doom metal influences that sort of work themselves in. Um, there's certainly a love of everything from Warning to Solstice in here as well, but I'm getting ahead of myself because the sound here is pretty unique. It is also changed somewhat dramatically from the first record, which focused on more a collision of sounds. It was designed around how the reverberations of everything worked together in creation of a sort of cavernous dream world, as it were. This record opts for clarity. It opts for um, an economy of statement within a very grand bit of sound design. And what is exactly does that mean to the listener? It means a much more professional sounding record that is a little bit more like organic. It feels less like a studio built idea, putting away the laptops and breaking out a lot more of those interesting um, accoutrement, if you will, with a lot of guest vocalists and different instrumental features that bring in some of their more unique influences outside of the expected uh, heavily atmospheric death doom metal realm. That doesn't mean that we've escaped the stuff you like about the band. It just means they sort of pull back a little bit on uh, the sound, which is relevant to more recent The Ruins of Everest, and certainly still relevant to fans of disembowelment and more so the effect of disembowelment rather than the actual brutality of the experience. Um, we definitely get, like I said, some of those British doom metal influences from the 90s, less so in structure and more so in sort of treatment of certain modes. Uh, and certain sections definitely hit upon references. I think the first song, which is quite a long 14-minute opener, um, becomes involved in waves of kind of showing off those influences. And the two that I point out here is a little bit of Gothic era Paradise Lost in the choice of guitar tones, and a little bit of riffs that definitely are directly taken from the best of Warning. And that's a good thing. I think it's a good reference, and it sort of helps add a little bit of emotional heft to a song, which really is continuing in the spirit and the stride of Tide's uh, Turn Eternal. Right? Did I get that right? Yeah. Tide Turns Eternal. But this is a very different album. It's you're sort of getting a grand conclusion in addition to sort of the fading end of the last album into this giant piece, which then crests on a little bit more of a somber piece and then descends into what I would consider an instrumental break that is a little bit extended, and it's got some shredding. Uh, Very much the way that I see it is sort of the impetus of the best and most celebrated sides of what is essentially progressive psychedelic rock. Um, and that means, I definitely reference a little bit of David Gilmour in here. I definitely think there's a little bit of Pink Floyd in everything that Derek Vella does. Maybe that's a little bit subconscious, but there's also some influences from indie rock and various things that are very subtle, but they're there as it has been stated. Um, Otherwise, there are really three acts here, and there, or you could see it as two very big acts and one very long intermission in the middle, and we don't get the sort of wall of statement that we did with the first album. We get uh, a more spacious trip in the middle, and then a very uh, strong thread of ideas that run through the first two songs and then the last two songs. So there's only five pieces here, and I suppose it will appear both more accessible per the much stronger sound design and less accessible per the structure of the thing, because it's not so much demanding, but much lighter on the aggressive sort of brutality in sort of regular intervals that we got with the first album. But what we get as a trade-off is much better songs and much less repetition. A lot of very intentional threads drawn from place to place. So it's less that they found the signature. They found that was special about that first record, and I don't think that either artist needed really any more feedback than they'd gotten before they'd released the album to make this album happen. And it kind of speaks to their talents that they just went ahead and just did it without anyone, suggesting anything further than had already been. So, well, what does that mean to the average listener? Probably just a much more professional sounding album, much more succinct and effective ideas. Um, Definitely a bit better guitar playing in terms of the leads. They're less strangling up the scale into this struggle to the peak and more presenting a very confident thread that may or may not interest you depending on what you like about lead guitars. I'm obviously a big fan of a lot of the more classic rock influences that find their way into his guitar playing, and I think that uh, there's it all works quite well together. Um, as a listening experience, I found it just even more immersive than the first one, a little bit less emotionally connective. I think there is a little bit more distance on this one, and only because it's maybe that it's just more um, transference more than anything else that was occurring with the first record. What we get here is a more direct narrative that they can control a little bit more, and also just beautiful art design. I think it's obvious enough just looking at it. So, as you would expect from a $20 spin release, everything has been considered and is quite well done. There's obviously like a well-oiled machine happening there that's got the checklist ready. So there's no real like I already gave the highest possible recommendation to the last album, even though I felt like it had some maybe not amateurish flaws, but things that could be improved upon. And this one both improves and continues, and sort of it's the right cadence for a second album. It's a little bit different, and they're definitely not going to repeat themselves for a third album. So for me, it's sort of in the spirit of everything I like about extreme metal, while also not being typical extreme metal at all. So the atmospheric and experiential value of this record ultimately outweighs a lot of the other intellectualizations that could happen, and it ends up being just effective, uh, spiritually influenced extreme metal in the doom metal format, which I enjoy so much. So a lot of these things come together for it being one of my favorite records of the year. But obviously, that'll depend on your tastes and what your interests are in terms of death doom metal. Uh, uh, Definitely the progressive side of things that pops up here, and the amount of patience that it definitely takes to experience the album a run and just sort of pick it right back up and go back in. It's a little bit more demanding in that regard. I think the first record was just quicker to just appease instant gratification. So keep that in mind. It still gets it's going to be up there on the top of my best of the year list. So see what you think, and I guess keep an open mind because it'll. This, like I said, this is a little bit more challenging, but also a little bit more rewarding overall for me once I'd given it the due time and diligence. So there you go.